The morning of September 15th, 2008 started like any other in the small mountain town of Riverside, Colorado. 8-year-old Jacob Torres was excited about the school camping trip to nearby Pinecrest National Forest. His mother, Diana, packed his favorite ham sandwiches while his father, Robert, double-checked the sleeping bag one more time. Jacob had been talking about this trip for weeks, eager to earn his first camping badge with his third-grade class. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of pine needles and wood smoke as the yellow school bus pulled away from Riverside Elementary at 8:30 a.m. 23 children and 4 adults headed into the wilderness for what should have been a memorable 3-day adventure. Diana waved from the driveway, already missing her son's infectious laughter that filled their modest 2-story home every morning. If you're following along with this incredible story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world as we explore these fascinating true mysteries together. The campsite at Pinecrest was a familiar destination for school groups, featuring well-marked trails, established fire pits, and easy access to ranger stations. Teacher Elizabeth Martinez had led this same trip 15 times without incident. The children spent their first day learning basic outdoor skills, collecting leaves for nature journals, and roasting marshmallows around the campfire. Jacob was particularly enthusiastic about tracking wildlife. His small notebook filled with sketches of deer prints and bird feathers he found scattered along the forest floor. On the second morning, September 16th, the group planned a nature hike along the Beaver Dam Trail, a well-maintained path that formed a gentle loop through the forest. At 10:15 a.m., as they prepared to head out, Elizabeth conducted her usual head count. 22 children stood in formation, backpacks secured and water bottles filled. Jacob Torres was nowhere to be found. His absence created an immediate sense of panic among the adults, who had never experienced anything like this during their years of organizing school trips. The initial search began immediately. Elizabeth sent 2 parent volunteers to check the restroom facilities, while she and teaching assistant Michael Rodriguez searched the immediate campsite area. They called Jacob's name repeatedly, their voices echoing through the tall pines that seemed to swallow their desperate calls. Within 30 minutes, when no trace of the boy emerged, Elizabeth made the call that would change everything. She contacted the park rangers for assistance, her hands shaking as she dialed the emergency number. Ranger Christopher Adams arrived within 20 minutes, bringing with him a systematic approach that had served him well during his 15 years patrolling Pinecrest. He immediately expanded the search perimeter and contacted the county sheriff's office. By noon, search teams were combing through the forest with trained dogs, their urgent barks mixing with the constant calling of Jacob's name that seemed to bounce endlessly between the towering trees without any response. Diana and Robert Torres received the phone call no parent ever wants to hear at 12:45 p.m. They were in Robert's construction office when Elizabeth's shaking voice delivered the news that would shatter their world completely. The 40-minute drive to Pinecrest felt endless, Diana gripping Robert's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. She kept thinking about Jacob's favorite toy car, a red pickup truck sitting on his unmade bed at home where he had left it that morning. The command post established at the campsite buzzed with controlled urgency. Sheriff Amanda Wilson coordinated teams of volunteers, professional search and rescue units, and helicopter crews. The weather was holding steady, but everyone knew that Colorado mountain conditions could change rapidly. September nights in Pinecrest regularly dropped below 40 degrees, dangerous for a child wearing only a light jacket and sneakers that offered little protection against the harsh mountain environment. Jacob's last confirmed sighting came from his tentmate, 9-year-old Kevin Thompson, who reported seeing him walking toward the edge of camp around 6:30 a.m., supposedly heading to the bathroom facilities. Security cameras were non-existent in the wilderness area, leaving investigators to piece together the timeline through witness statements from children whose memories proved frustratingly inconsistent under the stress of intensive questioning by concerned adults. As darkness fell on the second night, the search took on a more desperate quality. Powerful floodlights illuminated sections of forest that had never seen artificial light, creating eerie shadows that seemed to mock the searchers' efforts. The sound of helicopters continued through the night, their searchlights sweeping across acres of dense woodland, while families prayed for any sign of the missing boy. Diana spent the night at the command post, refusing to leave despite exhaustion, her eyes scanning every face of returning search teams for any sign of hope or devastating news. The investigation expanded beyond simple search and rescue as FBI agents arrived on the third day. Special Agent Laura Davis brought expertise in child abduction cases, though she emphasized to the media that all possibilities remained open until evidence suggested otherwise. The Torres family's background was thoroughly investigated. Robert's financial struggles with the construction business, Diana's work as a school nurse, their marriage stability, and any potential enemies or concerning associations that might explain Jacob's disappearance. Local media coverage intensified as the story gained national attention. News vans lined the narrow road leading to Pinecrest, reporters interviewing anyone connected to the case and seeking new angles to keep the story in the public eye. The town of Riverside, population 3,800, found itself thrust into an unwanted spotlight that disrupted daily life. Neighbors rallied around the Torres family, organizing meal trains and fundraising efforts for the expanding search operation that was costing thousands of dollars daily. Community members volunteered their time, businesses donated supplies, and local churches held prayer vigils that drew hundreds of concerned citizens who had never met the Torres family but felt compelled to help in any way possible. Days turned into weeks, with no substantive leads emerging from the massive search effort. The physical search covered over 80 square miles of rugged terrain that included steep cliffs, dense undergrowth, and dangerous rock formations. Caves were explored with specialized equipment, abandoned mining shafts investigated by experienced spelunkers, and water sources dragged by dive teams. Every piece of potential evidence, a fragment of fabric, a partial footprint, candy wrapper, was collected and analyzed by forensic experts. None belonged to Jacob. The psychological toll on the Torres family became increasingly evident as media attention continued and hope began to fade. Robert threw himself into the search efforts, spending 18-hour days coordinating volunteer teams and exploring remote areas that professional searchers might have missed. Diana struggled with overwhelming guilt, replaying every decision that led to allowing Jacob on the trip, wondering if she could have somehow prevented this nightmare. She began seeing a therapist after experiencing severe panic attacks triggered by the sound of school buses or children's laughter. The couple's relationship strained under the weight of shared grief and the constant presence of media attention that made private mourning impossible. After 6 months of intensive searching, the active search was officially scaled back, though it never officially ended according to department policy. The case file remained open, and periodic searches continued based on new tips or seasonal accessibility to remote areas that winter weather had made impossible to reach. The Torres family established a foundation dedicated to improving child safety protocols for school trips and supporting families of missing children who faced similar devastating circumstances. They organized annual fundraising events, lobbied for legislative changes in school trip supervision requirements, and created support networks for families navigating the complex emotional landscape of having a missing child. The years that followed were marked by false hopes and crushing disappointments that tested the family's resilience repeatedly. Reported sightings came from across the country. a boy matching Jacob's description spotted in a Phoenix shopping center, a child at a Nevada gas station who resembled aged-up computer projections of Jacob, mysterious phone calls with children's voices claiming to be the missing boy. Each lead was thoroughly investigated by dedicated detectives and ultimately proved unrelated to Jacob's disappearance, leaving the family emotionally drained but still clinging to hope that their son was alive somewhere. Diana and Robert's marriage survived the unthinkable stress, but not unchanged by the constant grief and uncertainty that permeated every aspect of their daily lives. They moved from their original home, unable to bear walking past Jacob's unchanged bedroom every day, where his toys remained exactly as he had left them on that September morning. Robert sold the construction business and took a job with steady hours that allowed him to be home for Diana, while she returned to full-time nursing, finding purpose in helping others heal from their own traumas and medical emergencies. They attended support groups for families of missing children, where Diana's strength and Robert's determination became sources of comfort for newly devastated parents who were just beginning their own journeys through this nightmare. The couple learned to recognize the stages of grief that families experience, the false hope that can be more damaging than acceptance, and the importance of maintaining some semblance of normal life while never giving up completely on finding answers. The Riverside community never forgot Jacob Torres, keeping his memory alive through various memorials and annual events that honored his spirit and supported his family. His school retired his jersey number from the Little League soccer team where he had played enthusiastically despite limited athletic ability. The annual town festival included a memorial walk in his honor that drew hundreds of participants each year, raising money for the Torres Family Foundation and keeping Jacob's story in the public consciousness. Local businesses displayed his missing person poster year after year, his 8-year-old face with bright eyes and missing front tooth becoming a permanent fixture in shop windows along Main Street. Detective work continued sporadically as new technologies became available to law enforcement agencies handling cold cases. DNA databases were searched for any matches. Digital age progression images were updated and redistributed through social media and law enforcement networks, and cold case specialists periodically reviewed the file with fresh eyes and new perspectives. Advanced search techniques were employed in previously inaccessible areas of Pinecrest, using ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging. But the forest kept its secrets buried beneath years of accumulated debris and seasonal changes that had altered the landscape significantly. The 10th anniversary of Jacob's disappearance brought renewed media attention and a comprehensive fresh review of all evidence by a specialized cold case unit. Detective Ryan Parker spent months re-interviewing witnesses, many of whom were now adults with clearer memories of that September day and different perspectives on what they had observed. He discovered minor inconsistencies in earlier statements and several witnesses who had never been properly questioned, but nothing substantial enough to redirect the investigation toward any concrete leads that might finally solve this mysterious case. By 2018, Diana and Robert had found a way to live with their devastating loss while maintaining hope that somehow, somewhere, their son was alive and might return to them. They spoke at conferences about missing children, advocated for improved search technologies and prevention programs, and continued supporting other families facing similar tragedies with the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving the unthinkable. Their relationship with Jacob's memory evolved from desperate searching to honoring his life through service to others who needed their help and understanding. They established scholarship programs in Jacob's name, funded search and rescue training programs, and worked tirelessly to ensure that other families would have better resources and support systems than they had experienced during their darkest hours. The 11th year passed quietly, marked only by the family's private memorial service and a small gathering of friends who had never stopped caring about Jacob or supporting his parents through their ongoing grief. The case had largely faded from public consciousness, relegated to cold case databases and occasional true crime podcast episodes that examined unsolved disappearances in national parks and wilderness areas. The Torres family had learned to carry their grief while building meaningful lives around the permanent absence of their son, finding ways to honor his memory while moving forward with purpose and determination. On March 18, 2020, as the world grappled with the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic that was shutting down normal life across the globe, a park ranger conducting routine trail maintenance in a remote section of Pinecrest made a discovery that would change everything the Torres family believed about their son's fate. Hidden beneath years of accumulated debris and fallen branches in an abandoned mining shaft that had been sealed off from public access for decades, he found remnants of an elaborate makeshift shelter that showed clear signs of long-term human habitation. The shelter consisted of plastic tarps arranged with remarkable engineering precision, empty food containers organized in systematic patterns that suggested careful resource management, and most importantly, a small notebook filled with a child's handwriting that had evolved dramatically over many years of entries. The ranger immediately contacted his supervisors, who recognized the potential significance of this discovery and contacted law enforcement agencies that had been involved in Jacob's case. The notebook contained daily entries spanning several years, written in increasingly sophisticated handwriting that documented an extraordinary survival story that seemed almost impossible to believe. The early entries, clearly written by a young child with basic spelling and simple sentence structures, described being lost and terrified after falling through concealed wooden boards, finding shelter in the mine shaft after injuring his ankle, and surviving on wild berries and stream water while hoping desperately for rescue that never came. Later entries showed remarkable adaptability and growing intelligence, as the child learned to survive in one of America's harshest wilderness environments. These pages detailed elaborate systems for trapping small animals like rabbits and squirrels, sophisticated techniques for preserving meat and edible plants through brutal Colorado winter months, and ingenious methods for maintaining warmth and shelter using only materials found in the forest. The handwriting progression told a story of a child growing into adolescence and then young adulthood while completely isolated from human civilization. The final entries, dated just 3 months earlier in December 2019, described a carefully considered decision to leave the forest after more than a decade and attempt to return to civilization. The handwriting belonged to someone much older and more educated than the 8-year-old boy who had vanished 12 years earlier, showing sophisticated vocabulary, complex reasoning about survival strategies, and emotional maturity that came from years of complete self-reliance. Carbon dating and forensic analysis confirmed the timeline matched Jacob's disappearance perfectly, and DNA evidence from hair samples found throughout the shelter matched Jacob Torres's genetic profile that had been stored in law enforcement databases since his disappearance. The discovery launched the largest manhunt in Colorado history, involving multiple federal and state law enforcement agencies, hundreds of trained volunteers, and resources that had never been mobilized for a single missing person case. If Jacob Torres was alive and had recently left the forest, where he had somehow survived for over a decade, he could potentially be anywhere in the western United States by this time, possibly heading toward populated areas where he might seek food, shelter, or human contact after years of complete isolation. Age progression specialists worked frantically around the clock to create updated images of what a 20-year-old Jacob might look like after years of wilderness survival, accounting for factors like prolonged malnutrition, extensive sun exposure, physical changes from constant outdoor living, and the psychological effects of extreme isolation. The FBI coordinated with law enforcement agencies across multiple states, focusing particularly on areas where a young man with severely limited social skills and no identification documents might seek assistance from homeless shelters, food banks, or charitable organizations that served vulnerable populations. 3 weeks after the notebook discovery on April 8, 2020, a homeless shelter director in Grand Junction, Colorado, contacted authorities about a young man who had arrived seeking assistance during the early pandemic lockdowns, when many social services were operating under emergency protocols. The individual, who appeared to be in his early 20s despite his uncertain age, presented with long, matted hair that suggested years without professional grooming, clothing fashioned from animal hides and salvaged materials that looked handmade, and behavior patterns that seemed completely inconsistent with normal social interaction. The young man had been reluctant to provide any personal information or identification documents, speaking primarily in fragments of sentences mixed with gestures and primitive communication methods. He seemed completely unfamiliar with basic modern technology like smartphones, computers, or even electric lighting systems, and displayed behavioral patterns entirely consistent with prolonged isolation from human society. Shelter staff noted that he appeared most comfortable outdoors, ate with his hands rather than utensils, and showed signs of severe anxiety when surrounded by groups of people. When shelter social workers showed him photographs of the Torres family during a carefully conducted interview designed to assess his mental state and background, the young man's reaction was immediate and deeply emotional. He whispered "Mama" while touching Diana's picture with trembling fingers that showed extensive scarring and calluses, then broke down crying while repeatedly saying "Papa, Papa" over the image of his father, using the childhood nickname he had called Robert throughout his early years. These reactions, combined with his physical appearance and the timing of his arrival, prompted immediate contact with law enforcement agencies handling Jacob's case. DNA testing was rushed through the laboratory using emergency protocols, and results confirmed what everyone hoped but hardly dared believe after 12 years of searching and disappointment. This weathered young man, transformed by over a decade of wilderness survival, was indeed Jacob Torres, alive against all odds after 12 years of surviving completely alone in one of Colorado's most challenging wilderness environments. The reunion at Denver General Hospital was both joyful beyond description and heartbreaking in its complexity, representing the culmination of 12 years of hope, fear, and unwavering parental love. Jacob, now 20 years old, was physically healthy despite his ordeal, but psychologically transformed by his extraordinary experience in ways that would require years of therapy and adjustment to fully understand. He clearly remembered his parents and showed genuine emotion upon seeing them, but struggled with normal conversation patterns, spoke primarily in simple sentences mixed with Spanish phrases he had somehow retained from his childhood, and displayed obvious signs of severe social anxiety when surrounded by more than 2 or 3 people at once. His physical appearance told the story of his survival in remarkable detail. Jacob's body bore numerous scars from injuries and accidents that had occurred during his wilderness years, deeply calloused hands that showed evidence of constant tool-making and manual labor, and the lean, wiry muscle definition of someone who had lived by hunting, gathering, fishing, and constant physical activity for over a decade. His skin showed extensive sun damage and weathering. His hair had grown long and unkempt, and his posture and movement patterns suggested someone more comfortable navigating natural terrain than indoor spaces. Medical examinations revealed remarkable physiological adaptations to wilderness life that fascinated doctors and researchers who had never encountered anything similar in medical literature. Jacob had developed significantly enhanced night vision capabilities that allowed him to see clearly in low-light conditions that would leave most people functionally blind, extraordinarily acute hearing that enabled him to detect sounds from great distances and identify their sources with remarkable precision, and an intuitive understanding of weather patterns and natural phenomena that bordered on supernatural awareness of environmental changes. His immune system showed evidence of exposure to numerous pathogens and environmental challenges that had built extraordinary natural defenses against diseases and infections. Nutritionally, despite years of subsistence living on wild foods with no access to modern dietary supplements or medical care, he was surprisingly healthy in most measurable respects. Though significantly shorter and lighter than normal growth charts would predict for someone his age, suggesting that prolonged nutritional limitations had affected his physical development during crucial adolescent years. The psychological evaluation conducted by a team of specialists painted a complex picture of both severe trauma and remarkable resilience that amazed mental health professionals who had worked with survival victims and isolated populations. Jacob clearly remembered falling through rotted wooden boards into the abandoned mine shaft on his second day of being lost, severely injuring his ankle in the fall and being completely unable to climb out despite desperate attempts that left him exhausted and more seriously injured. Rather than succumbing to panic, despair, or the psychological breakdown that would affect most children in similar circumstances, he had somehow demonstrated survival instincts and problem-solving abilities that seemed almost impossible for an 8-year-old child to possess. He had systematically explored his underground prison, identified sources of water seeping through rock formations, discovered ways to create primitive tools from mining debris left in the shaft, and eventually learned to start fires using techniques he had apparently observed during the camping trip or developed through trial and error. His notebook entries, when analyzed by psychiatrists and behavioral specialists, revealed the remarkable journey of a child's mind adapting to extraordinary circumstances with creativity, determination, and emotional resilience that defied conventional understanding of child psychology. The earliest entries, written in crayon, he had somehow found among the mining debris, expressed desperate hope for rescue combined with terror of dying alone in the darkness of the underground shaft where he was trapped. Middle-period entries focused primarily on practical survival concerns, like finding reliable food sources, developing techniques for staying warm during brutally cold Colorado winters, learning to avoid or deal with dangerous wildlife, and creating increasingly sophisticated tools and shelter improvements. These entries showed a gradual acceptance of his situation, combined with growing confidence in his ability to survive independently, suggesting psychological adaptation that allowed him to function effectively despite complete isolation from human contact. Later entries revealed a young man who had not only accepted his isolation, but had developed a complex, almost spiritual relationship with the wilderness environment that had become simultaneously his prison and his home. These mature writings showed sophisticated understanding of natural cycles, deep appreciation for the intricate relationships between different species and environmental systems, and philosophical reflections on solitude, survival, and the meaning of human existence that would be remarkable coming from someone with normal educational background and life experiences. Reintegration into modern society proved far more challenging than anyone involved in Jacob's care had anticipated, requiring specialized therapy approaches and extraordinary patience from everyone involved in his recovery process. Jacob struggled severely with indoor lighting systems that hurt his eyes after years of adaptation to natural light cycles, became overwhelmed and anxious when surrounded by crowds of more than 3 or 4 people, and showed little interest in or understanding of technology that had developed significantly during his 12-year absence from civilization. Modern devices like smartphones, computers, tablets, and even television systems seemed to cause him genuine distress and confusion. He strongly preferred sleeping on hard floors rather than soft mattresses, eating with his hands instead of utensils that felt foreign and awkward, and spending virtually all daylight hours outdoors where he felt comfortable, secure, and able to function normally. Indoor spaces made him claustrophobic and anxious, while natural environments immediately calmed his obvious stress and allowed his personality to emerge more clearly. The overwhelming media attention that followed news of Jacob's return proved particularly challenging for someone who had lived in complete solitude for over a decade. News outlets worldwide covered what they called the miracle of Riverside, describing Jacob's survival as one of the most remarkable cases in modern history and drawing comparisons to fictional characters like Tarzan or real-life feral children who had been raised by animals. Documentary filmmakers, book publishers, television producers, and talk show hosts all sought exclusive interviews and media rights. But the Torres family worked with legal advisors to carefully limit all media exposure in order to protect Jacob's fragile psychological state and allow him time to adjust gradually to human contact again. Recovery specialists, therapists, and medical professionals worked with Jacob for many months, helping him readjust to human contact and basic modern conveniences with infinite patience and carefully structured approaches. Progress was measured in small victories and occasional setbacks that reminded everyone involved of the magnitude of Jacob's adjustment challenges. He gradually became more comfortable with indoor plumbing systems, electric lights, equipped with dimmer switches that allowed him to control brightness levels, and prepared foods that didn't require hunting, foraging, or elaborate preparation techniques he had developed during his wilderness years. His vocabulary and communication skills expanded steadily as dormant language abilities reactivated through constant interaction with family members, therapists, and medical staff who understood his unique situation and adjusted their communication styles accordingly. Spanish phrases and words that he had retained from childhood began mixing more naturally with English, as his confidence in social situations slowly improved through carefully managed exposure to gradually larger groups of people. Diana and Robert marveled daily at their son's incredible transformation, while simultaneously grieving the childhood and adolescence he had lost to circumstances completely beyond anyone's control or prevention. The 8-year-old boy who had loved soccer games, video games, and typical childhood activities had become a young man whose survival skills impressed military experts and wilderness professionals, but whose emotional and social development had been completely interrupted by 12 years of total isolation from human society and normal developmental experiences. They celebrated his miraculous return and survival while also mourning the countless shared experiences they had missed during his absence. Birthdays, holidays, school events, graduations, family vacations, and thousands of daily moments that constitute normal family life and child development. Learning to know and relate to the man their son had become required tremendous emotional adjustment and acceptance of the reality that Jacob would never be the same person he would have become under normal circumstances. Jacob slowly began sharing detailed accounts of his wilderness years through carefully structured conversations with therapists and gradual discussions with family members who were prepared to hear difficult truths about his experiences. He described developing complex understanding of animal migration patterns that changed with seasons, learning which plants were edible through careful experimentation that sometimes resulted in illness, and creating sophisticated techniques for preserving meat and edible vegetation through harsh winter months when food sources became extremely scarce. He had constructed multiple shelters throughout different areas of the vast forest, moving seasonally to optimize survival conditions and avoid dangerous weather patterns that could be fatal for someone without proper equipment or backup resources. His knowledge of wildlife behavior, weather prediction, plant identification, and wilderness survival techniques had developed to levels that amazed professional outdoorsmen and survival experts who tested his abilities and found them remarkably comprehensive and practical. The most remarkable aspect of his extraordinary survival story was his emotional and mental resilience, despite complete isolation from human contact for over 12 crucial developmental years. Jacob had somehow maintained his fundamental sanity and emotional stability through elaborate mental exercises, detailed imaginary conversations with family members whose faces he had memorized, and a deep spiritual connection to the natural world that had sustained him through the darkest and most desperate moments of his ordeal. Throughout his entire wilderness experience, he had never completely abandoned hope of eventually returning home to his parents, though he had learned to find genuine peace, purpose, and even contentment in his solitary existence among the wildlife and natural systems that had become his entire world. This psychological resilience, combined with his remarkable survival skills, had enabled him to not merely survive, but to develop into a unique individual whose perspective on life, nature, and human relationships had been shaped by experiences unlike anything in recorded human history. Today, Jacob Torres lives quietly in Riverside with his parents, working part-time at a local wilderness education center, where his extraordinary knowledge and skills make him an invaluable instructor for survival courses and outdoor education programs. His story continues to inspire hope in families of missing children worldwide, while serving as a powerful reminder that human resilience and adaptability can triumph over circumstances that seem impossible to survive.